The Louisiana sun had a cruel way of shining, bright enough to blind a man, yet never warm enough to thaw the cold that lived in his bones. Josiah felt it every morning when the horn blew and the fields came alive with the sound of chains, coughing, and the slow drag of enslaved feet through dew and dirt. He had been born on the Worth plantation, property of Elias Worth, a man whose name carried the scent of tobacco and blood. Josiah was not like the others. His hands were as strong as any man's, but his eyes, sharp, silent, and calculating, saw more than they should have. He noticed how the overseer counted bales of cotton, how Worth measured his coins at night by lamplight, how debt had begun to eat the man alive from behind his proud smile. Josiah listened, learned, and remembered every word. He knew the power of a signature, the weight of a dollar, the danger of knowledge. By 1849, the Worth plantation stood like a kingdom about to fall. Elias Worth had gambled half his fortune on riverboats that sailed between New Orleans and Natchez, chasing easy gold and whiskey courage. He had no son to inherit, only a fragile wife, Caroline, pale and beautiful as the moon, trapped in a marriage colder than the marble floors she walked upon. She spoke softly to Josiah once, after seeing his wife whipped for stopping to tend their sick child. "You'll bury me before he buries you," she whispered, her voice trembling like wind in the cane fields. That prophecy would come true. The night the storm rolled over Louisiana, the air was thick with thunder and the smell of rain-soaked earth. Worth had lost everything. $100,000 gone in a single game of cards. He staggered home drunk, his rage like a living thing. He screamed through the halls that someone must pay. And Josiah's wife was the first name from his lips. Josiah heard it from the shadows, standing by the servants' quarters. His heart went still. The world turned quiet. When he entered the big house that night, he carried no weapon at first, only the calm of a man who has made a decision too heavy to reverse. The pistol he found on the mantel was polished and waiting, a symbol of Worth's power. When the shot rang out, the rain swallowed the sound. Elias Worth fell forward across his ledger, face down in his own accounts. The ink spread beneath his blood like spilled fortune. Josiah stood still, breathing in the scent of gunpowder and release. Then came footsteps, soft, steady, deliberate. Caroline Worth appeared in the doorway wearing her nightgown and pearls. She saw the body, saw Josiah's hand trembling around the pistol, and for a moment the two simply stared. Then she closed the door behind her. The next morning, the plantation woke to silence. The master was ill, the mistress said. No one saw the burial but Josiah and Caroline. Beneath a magnolia tree where the ground stayed dry, they laid him to rest in a coffin of unmarked pine. The rain washed away the tracks, the papers proving ownership of the land, the deeds, debts, and signatures, burned that same night in the hearth, curling to ash as Caroline watched. Weeks turned into months. The plantation no longer ran on cruelty but on quiet. Caroline summoned Josiah often to her study, asking for advice, for company, for truth. He spoke little, but his presence steadied her. By spring, tongues began to wag in whispers. Some said the mistress had taken a lover, others said she had gone mad. But when she walked the veranda arm in arm with Josiah, the world learned that both could be true. In 1850, under the veil of midnight, they were married by candlelight, not in church, but in the very room where Elias Worth had died. 2 servants witnessed, 1 wept. Caroline did not. Together they built an empire on secrets and soil. The fields grew richer, the trade more cunning. By the time the Civil War erupted, Josiah Worth, as he now called himself, had become a name that frightened men in Washington and New Orleans alike. He had started as property. He would die as legend. But legend, like gold, never shines without blood beneath it. The Louisiana sun had a way of burning through even the thickest clouds, turning sweat to salt and soil to dust. For most, it was just another day under the lash. But for Josiah, it was a stage, and he was learning his lines quietly. Day by day, year by year. He was born into slavery, but his mind was never bound. While others bowed their heads, Josiah watched. He studied how Elias Worth, the master of the plantation, counted his coins, sweet, talked the merchants, and buried his sins in ledgers written with trembling ink. Elias Worth was a man of charm in daylight and cruelty by night. His fields stretched as far as a man could see, his cotton built on backs that bent until they broke. His laughter carried across the land like a curse. Josiah knew it well, that coarse wine-soaked chuckle that came before the whip cracked. But beneath the surface of Worth's wealth was rot. Gambling had become his second master, and the Mississippi riverboats his silent thieves. He would leave the plantation dressed like royalty and return smelling of bourbon and loss. Josiah's sharp eyes missed nothing. He knew the overseer's routines, the secret deals, the way Elias hid gold beneath the floorboards of his study. When Elias spoke to the banker from Baton Rouge, Josiah lingered outside the door, pretending to polish the handle. He heard Worth's desperate tone, the word debt whispered like a sickness. And in that moment, Josiah learned something powerful. A white man could be owned too, if you knew what chained him. His wife, Caroline Worth, was unlike her husband. Pale, delicate, and sad-eyed, she moved through the mansion like a ghost who had forgotten to die. There was a loneliness in her gaze, a silent mourning that had no end. She once caught Josiah looking at her, not with desire, but with understanding, and she did not turn away. That small exchange lit a quiet spark, one neither dared to name. Then came the night that turned the soil red. It was late in the summer of 1849. The rain came down in heavy sheets, drumming against the roof, blurring the edges of the world. Elias Worth stumbled home from a riverboat in New Orleans, soaked and furious. He had lost $100 in one night, a sum so large it would ruin even his pride. As he stormed through the parlor, he shouted for his ledger, for his overseer, for his slaves. His face twisted when he saw Josiah standing silent in the doorway. "You," he spat, pointing. "Your wife and brat. They'll fetch enough to keep me standing." Something broke inside Josiah then. Not rage, no, something colder. He did not shout or weep. He simply turned and walked out into the storm, the mud pulling at his feet like memory. When he returned, the pistol gleamed in his hand, one of Elias Worth's prized dueling guns, polished and loaded. Worth was sitting at his desk, counting what little remained of his fortune. His back was turned. Josiah stepped closer, so close he could see the sweat running down the man's neck. One shot. That was all. The thunder outside swallowed the sound. Worth's body slumped forward, face pressed into his own accounts. Blood mixed with ink until they were one color, the shade of secrets. Josiah stood there, breathing slow, heart steady. He didn't tremble. He didn't pray. Then, footsteps came soft, measured, and sure. Caroline Worth entered the room, candle in hand. The flame wavered as her eyes fell upon her husband's corpse, then lifted to meet Josiah's. They said nothing. The silence between them was sacred, heavy, and binding. She didn't scream. She didn't call for help. She simply whispered, "It had to be done." That night, they buried Elias Worth beneath the magnolia trees, where the soil stayed dry and roots grew deep. Caroline herself shoveled the last of the dirt. When dawn came, the plantation stirred with gossip, but none dared to ask questions. The mistress said her husband had taken ill, that he'd gone away for treatment in New Orleans. Few doubted her. Fear has a way of keeping mouths closed. In the nights that followed, Caroline and Josiah met often in the study, the same room where blood had dried between the floorboards. She burned her husband's ledgers one by one, watching the pages curl and blacken. The crackle of fire was their only witness. "His sins made this house," she said once, voice low. "We'll build something better from the ashes." Weeks became months. The overseer disappeared mysteriously one night after threatening to expose them. Caroline's grief turned to steel, and Josiah became more than a servant. He was her shadow, her confidant, her equal in everything but name. In 1850, under a moon pale as bone, they were married. No priest, no crowd, just two trembling candles and two loyal witnesses. It was illegal, blasphemous, and beautiful. Caroline kissed him first, not in fear, but in defiance of a world that would hang them both for it. From that night forward, the Worth plantation changed. The whips were gone. Workers were paid. Fields flourished. Caroline signed the papers, but it was Josiah's mind that drove the business. His mastery of numbers, and people turned ruin into fortune. Merchants from New Orleans began calling him Mr. Worth, and even the proudest whites dared not correct themselves. By the dawn of the Civil War, Josiah had become a quiet power, a man who sold to both North and South, who fed soldiers and buried secrets. The locals called him the Black Baron of Louisiana. They feared him, envied him, and never quite understood how a former slave could hold such sway. When Caroline died in 1865, Josiah stood alone at her grave. She had given him her name, her land, her heart. Now she gave him silence. Her death left him the wealthiest black man in the South, a man built on blood, love, and cunning. In his final years, Josiah poured money into schools for freedmen and churches for the broken. He said little of his past, but sometimes, when the wind blew across the magnolia trees, he'd whisper, "I paid my price." When he died in 1872, his estate was worth more than 300,000, a king's ransom for a man once born in chains. On his grave, there were no titles, no boasts, only 5 carved words. He paid his own price. And beneath those words, in the silence of the Louisiana soil, Elias Worth still slept. The man the South called Elias Worth wore his respectability like armor. A gentleman's suit, a gold pocket watch, and a voice that could charm snakes into obedience. On Sundays, he prayed with perfect posture, his Bible open to verses about mercy and righteousness. But those who lived beneath his rule knew better. Beneath that polished veneer lay a heart blackened by greed, lust, and cruelty. Worth had been born into privilege, not intelligence. His father, a shrewd English trader, had built the Worth fortune through sweat, sugar, and slavery. Elias inherited not his father's wisdom. He wanted to be known not merely as rich but as powerful, a man feared, envied, and obeyed. By 1838, he had turned the Louisiana estate into one of the largest cotton plantations in the region, its profits measured not in bales but in human suffering. Each morning, he would ride through the fields with a glass of whiskey in hand, barking orders at men who had no choice but to obey. His laughter followed the whip. He often said, "Discipline is mercy in disguise." Those words echoed through the cane brakes long after he'd gone inside to rest beneath his silk sheets. But for all his wealth, Elias Worth was a gambler at heart, and not the clever kind. His hunger for risk was an illness that grew with every win. The first time he stepped onto a Mississippi riverboat, the thrill of cards and bourbon seduced him. By the time he turned 40, he spent more nights at gambling tables than in his own home. Caroline, his wife, stopped waiting up for him. The servants whispered that the master's soul belonged not to God, but to the devil who dealt the cards. The riverboat nights were poison wrapped in perfume. Chandeliers swung with the motion of the waves, and smoke thickened the air until faces became blurs. Elias would sit there, eyes bright, fingers trembling, the scent of whiskey heavy on his breath, betting away what generations had built. One night he'd win enough to buy another 100 acres. The next, he'd lose it all before dawn. He began pawning off small things first, silver cups, imported rugs, even Caroline's jewelry. He told her they were being cleaned in New Orleans. When she asked questions, he'd strike the table with his cane and roar, "A wife has no need to know a man's affairs." By 1849, Elias Worth was drowning in debt. The men he owed were not gentlemen. They were river sharks, swindlers, and killers dressed in velvet. To cover his losses, he started selling off human lives. He told Josiah to prepare lists of the strongest men and healthiest women for the trader from Baton Rouge. Josiah, with quiet obedience, wrote the names, including his own wife's. That night, Josiah did not sleep. He sat by the cabin window, staring out at the mansion's distant lights flickering against the rain. The sound of laughter floated through the wet air. Worth's voice, deep and careless, celebrating his cruelty with more drink. Josiah's child coughed softly beside him. His wife touched his arm and whispered, "Don't fight him. He'll kill you." Josiah said nothing. He just stared at the storm and thought of the word freedom, not as hope, but as vengeance. Inside the mansion, Elias sat at his desk, tallying debts he could no longer pay. His hands shook, not from guilt, but from drink. His reflection in the window looked older than his years, the eyes sunken, the mouth a hard, cruel line. Somewhere in that reflection, he saw a glimpse of himself not as master, but as prey, and he hated it. He shouted for his wife. Caroline appeared in the doorway, her face pale from sleepless nights. "Do you love me?" he demanded suddenly. She froze, unsure of the trap. When she didn't answer fast enough, he laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "You love the money?" he said. "That's what all women love." She whispered something under her breath, something he didn't hear. It wasn't prayer. Elias took another drink and slumped into his chair, muttering about betrayal, about slaves who watched him with too much intelligence, about a world conspiring to humiliate him. The mansion had become his cage, and the ghosts of his debts followed him everywhere. He began taking his anger out on the only ones who couldn't fight back. Whippings grew longer, punishments harsher. One morning, he had a young boy flogged for breaking a plate. The screams echoed across the fields. Josiah stood among the workers, fists clenched, eyes fixed on the master's silhouette against the rising sun. That night, Caroline came to the slave quarters for the first time. She carried a basket of food, bread, apples, a small bottle of medicine. Her eyes met Josiah's, and in them he saw both pity and rebellion. "He's going to kill us all," she said quietly, "one by one until nothing is left but his name." Josiah's jaw tightened. He said only, "Names don't live forever." By then, Elias Worth was worth less than his title. The plantation was drowning in silence, a silence that smelled like gunpowder waiting for a spark. The workers whispered of revolt. The mistress moved like a ghost, and the master grew paranoid, sleeping with a pistol under his pillow. Then came that fateful storm in late summer. The sky split open like judgment. Worth stumbled home with mud on his boots and rage in his throat. He threw his coat across the room, spilling a handful of worthless playing cards onto the floor. $800,000! He bellowed. "Gone! You hear me, woman? Gone!" Caroline trembled but did not cry. He turned on her, his face twisted. "You'll sell the silver, the horses, the servants. That black bastard's wife will fetch a fine price." The house went quiet. Caroline froze. The words hung between them like thunder waiting to strike. Outside, Josiah listened, his heart beating like a drum of war. Elias laughed, a madman's laugh, and poured himself another drink. "I made this place," he muttered, "and I'll burn it before I see it taken." He never saw the shadow that entered behind him. Within an hour, the storm had taken 2 lives, one to the grave and one to sin. The next morning, the mansion stood still beneath a gray sky. Elias Worth was gone, but his ghost lingered in every corner, in the polished glass, the ledgers, the walls that had witnessed his cruelty. The overseer asked questions no one answered. Caroline's eyes stayed dry. Josiah's hands stayed clean, though his soul never would again. The Worth fortune, once filthy with sin, now belonged to the two who had washed it in blood. And in the South, they whispered a new name, Josiah Worth, spoken with awe, envy, and fear. By the summer of 1849, Louisiana's air hung heavy, thick with heat, secrets, and the stench of debt. The Worth plantation stood proud from the outside, its white columns gleaming under the sun, but rot had already crept into its foundation. Behind the facade of elegance lay ledgers filled with lies, loans unpaid, and promises Elias Worth could no longer keep. The man who once bragged that he could buy a governor's favor now couldn't buy his way out of a card game. His name still carried weight in polite circles, but whispers had begun to chase him like shadows. The planters' wives murmured about poor Mr. Worth, who drank too much and smiled too wide. The bankers of Baton Rouge began to tighten their terms. The gamblers of New Orleans started to see through his bluff. And the slaves, those who labored, listened and remembered, felt the change in the air. The lash grew more frequent, the rations smaller. The master was bleeding money, and when a rich man bleeds, everyone beneath him suffers. Josiah noticed everything. He saw the overseer's nervous hands, the way Caroline avoided her husband's gaze at supper, and the tremor in Worth's voice when he spoke of business matters. Josiah did not gloat. He waited. He had learned long ago that the best revenge was patience sharpened to a knife's edge. One August evening, a letter arrived, sealed in black wax, smelling faintly of smoke and whiskey. Elias tore it open at his desk. His lips moved silently as he read, then his face drained of color. "The debt," he muttered, over and over like a curse. That night he packed his pistol, a pouch of coins, and left for New Orleans without explanation. Caroline watched from the veranda as his carriage disappeared down the muddy road, the sky behind him swollen with storm clouds. She said a prayer that did not include his name. On the riverboat Magnolia Belle, Elias Worth met his fate. Not through gunfire or poison, but through greed. The tables were crowded with the usual devils, planters, captains, con men dressed as gentlemen. The air buzzed with laughter and deceit. Elias sat down to play, certain he could win back what fortune had stolen. For hours he played recklessly, losing more with every hand, his temper rising with each loss. Across from him sat a man known only as "Oh, Mr. Bishop," a quiet gambler with eyes like wet coal. Bishop dealt each hand slowly, speaking little. The pile of gold before him grew. Worth's grew smaller, then vanished altogether. By dawn, Elias Worth had lost everything, his money, his horses, even the deed to a portion of his land. Still, he begged for one more chance. Bishop smiled faintly, shuffling the cards with a grace that was almost cruel. "What have you left to wager, Mr. Worth?" he asked. Elias hesitated, then whispered, "Slaves, strong ones, men, women, children." The words made a few men at the table look away, but Bishop did not flinch. He dealt the final hand. Worth lost again. The gambler rose, collected his winnings, and offered Worth a drink. For the road, Elias refused. His pride was the only thing he had left, and even that was cracked. When he stumbled off the boat hours later, the sun had risen over the Mississippi, golden and merciless. He reeked of whiskey, sweat, and defeat. By the time he reached the plantation that night, rain was falling hard. His clothes were soaked, his eyes wild. He stormed through the door, slamming it behind him. Caroline rushed to meet him, but he pushed past, shouting, "Gone! It's all gone!" She begged him to calm down, to rest, but he was beyond reason. "Do you know what they called me?" he roared. "A fool! A pauper! Me!" His words slurred with liquor, his hands trembling with fury. Then came the moment that sealed every fate in that house. He turned toward the parlor, where Josiah was quietly polishing the mantel clock. "You!" he bellowed, pointing at him with shaking fingers. "Your wife and brat, fine, healthy, good teeth. They'll fetch enough to buy me back my name." Josiah froze. The world seemed to slow, the firelight flickering across Worth's red face. Caroline gasped, but Elias only sneered. "Don't look at me like that," he hissed. "You're property, and property pays its master's debt." Josiah said nothing. He placed the clock gently on the mantel, bowed his head, and walked out into the storm. Caroline followed him to the porch. "Don't," she whispered. "Please." But Josiah didn't answer. His silence was colder than the rain. Inside, Elias staggered toward his study, muttering curses. He poured himself another drink, spilling bourbon across his ledger. Lightning flashed through the window, illuminating the pistol lying beside his hand. He was too drunk to notice the shadow that lingered just beyond the doorway. The clock in the hall struck midnight. Josiah stepped inside without a sound. His clothes clung to his body, soaked from rain, his eyes steady and calm. He stood behind the man who had owned his life. Worth didn't turn. He was mumbling numbers, debts, the names of men who laughed at him. 100,000, he muttered. "That's all I need." A click echoed in the room. Elias turned too late. The flash came first, bright, white, merciful. The sound came next, swallowed by thunder. Worth's body slumped forward, his glass shattering beside him. Blood soaked the ledger, the ink blooming like flowers across the page. Josiah stood over him, breathing slow, steady. His expression held neither hatred nor regret, only a grim calm. The peace of a man who had finally made balance with his world. Then he heard the door open. Caroline stood there in her nightgown, her hair loose around her shoulders. Her eyes went from Josiah to the body on the floor. For a long, terrible moment, neither spoke. Then she stepped forward, lifted the candle she carried, and said softly, "Help me." Together they wrapped the corpse in a sheet and carried it out into the storm. The rain was their accomplice, washing away the trail of blood as they dragged the body across the soaked lawn to the magnolia grove. There, beneath the oldest tree, they dug in silence. The only sounds were the rustle of rain and the steady thud of the shovel. When the hole was deep enough, Josiah laid Elias Worth inside, covered him with soil, and whispered, "Paid in full." By dawn the storm had passed. The house smelled of wet earth and whiskey. Caroline burned the blood-stained ledger in the fireplace. Josiah watched as the ink turned to smoke. "It's done," she said quietly. Josiah nodded once, but debts never die easily. The land itself seemed to remember what they'd buried beneath it, a secret heavy enough to bend the air around it. From that night on, the Worth plantation no longer belonged to Elias. It belonged to the two souls who shared his sin, bound by murder, silence, and the beginning of an empire. The Worth plantation did not sleep the night Elias died. The storm had howled itself into exhaustion, leaving behind a world damp and silent, as if even the heavens feared to breathe. Inside the manor house, the air was thick with the scent of gunpowder and rain. The fire had gone out, leaving shadows to crawl across the walls like restless spirits. In those shadows, two people stood, one guilty by act, the other by choice. Josiah's hand still trembled faintly as he placed the pistol on the desk. The shot that ended his master's life had been swift, but the echo of it lingered, humming through the wooden floors and bleeding into the silence. Elias Worth lay crumpled across his ledger, his fine waistcoat darkened by a slow, spreading stain. His eyes, once sharp, cruel, and commanding, were now open and empty, reflecting nothing. Caroline stood a few paces away, barefoot, her nightgown clinging to her in the damp air. Her candlelight flickered across the scene, painting the room in gold and red. She said nothing for a long time. Josiah waited for the scream that never came. Instead, she stepped closer, looked down at the man who had been her husband, and whispered, "So this is peace." Josiah didn't answer. His chest rose and fell, steady and controlled, though every heartbeat felt like thunder in his ears. "He would have sold them," he said finally. His first words since the act. "My wife. My child. I know," she replied quietly. "He would have sold me too, in his own way." The two of them stood there as the storm subsided outside. Caroline knelt beside the body, her fingers brushing the blood that had spread across the ledger. "Everything he owned is written here," she murmured. "His debts, his sins, his empire." Then she looked up at Josiah. It should end with him. He understood what she meant before she spoke the words. Within minutes, they had gathered the papers, deeds, loan notes, shipping receipts, and carried them to the fireplace. Caroline lit them one by one. The flames swallowed them hungrily, the ink curling into ash. The smoke that rose smelled faintly of ink and sin. Outside, lightning flickered across the fields, revealing rows of soaked cotton swaying like ghosts. The storm had turned the soil to black mud, perfect for burying what needed to be forgotten. When the last paper had burned, Caroline turned to Josiah. "We can't leave him here," she said. Her voice no longer trembled. "The servants will find him come morning." Josiah nodded. "Where?" "The magnolia grove," she answered without hesitation. "It's dry beneath the roots." He used to boast that nothing could rot there. Together they wrapped the body in a sheet torn from the master's bed. Josiah lifted him, heavy, lifeless, the weight of tyranny itself, and carried him down the hallway. Caroline followed, holding the candle, her bare feet silent on the floorboards. The wind moaned through the corridors as they descended the stairs, past portraits of Worth ancestors whose painted eyes seemed to watch them with disgusted fascination. They crossed the veranda and stepped into the wet grass. The rain had weakened to a drizzle, and fog crept low across the ground. In the distance, the magnolia trees loomed like silent witnesses. Josiah began to dig with the same hands that had once picked Worth's cotton. Each shovelful of dirt struck the earth like a heartbeat, rhythm steady and deliberate. Caroline stood beside him, her candles shielded beneath her hand, her face unreadable. When the hole was deep enough, Josiah lowered the body in. For a moment, the two simply stared, at what they had done, at what they had become. "Say something," Caroline whispered. Josiah's voice was soft, almost reverent. "He called it his land," he said. "Now it will keep him." Caroline's lips trembled into something between a smile and a sob. "Then let it be so." They covered the grave in silence. When it was done, the candle had burned nearly to its base. The magnolia petals, heavy with rain, began to fall around them, white against the dark mud. A funeral the heavens had arranged without invitation. By the time dawn broke, Elias Worth was gone from the world. Caroline and Josiah returned to the manor in silence. She poured 2 glasses of whiskey, handed one to him, and said, "From this night, nothing leaves these walls without our consent." Her tone was calm, measured, and final. Josiah raised his glass and drank. That morning, when the first servants arrived, Caroline met them at the door dressed in black. "The master has taken ill," she announced. "He left before dawn to see the doctor in New Orleans. Until his return, all orders come through me." None dared to question her. Days passed, then weeks. Elias Worth was never mentioned again. The overseer grew suspicious but said nothing. The workers kept their heads low. Josiah went about his tasks as usual, though he now walked the grounds with a new quiet authority. The plantation continued to run. The cotton shipped. The books balanced. But its master was now a secret buried under magnolia roots. Caroline began spending long hours with Josiah in her late husband's study. To the servants, she claimed it was business. The truth was stranger, and far more dangerous. They spoke little of the night of the murder, but everything between them carried its echo. Guilt bound them at first, something darker and deeper followed. She trusted no one but him, and he, in turn, obeyed no one but her. One evening, she looked up from the ledger Josiah had rewritten and said softly, "You know this place better than anyone. It should have been yours all along," while Josiah's eyes met hers. "Now it is." It was not a declaration of power but of fact. The shift was complete. In that house, in that moment, Elias Worth's ghost gave way to something new, a union born not of love, not yet, but of necessity and shared sin. When Caroline dismissed the overseer a month later, Josiah took over his duties. The men began to defer to him. The women whispered his name with caution and curiosity. Mr. Worth. Some began to call him in private. It was both blasphemy and prophecy. At night, when the wind rattled the shutters, Caroline would sometimes awaken in terror, sure she heard her dead husband's footsteps in the hall. On those nights, Josiah would rise from his cot outside her chamber and stand guard until morning. Neither spoke of fear, but both felt it, like a shadow at the foot of their bed. Yet in the daylight, a strange peace took hold of the plantation. The cruelty that had defined the Worth legacy vanished. The lash no longer cracked. The workers were fed well. The land prospered again, as though the soil itself approved of its new keepers. Still, beneath the magnolia tree, the earth sometimes shifted after heavy rain, as if something beneath it refused to rest. And when the wind blew from the south, Caroline swore she could still smell whiskey and gunpowder drifting through the halls of the Worth plantation. Caroline Worth awoke each morning to the same echo, the sound of that single gunshot that ended her husband's life. It did not fade with time. It merely changed its voice. Sometimes it came as the crack of a door in the night, sometimes as the echo of thunder across the fields. It reminded her that peace, for her and Josiah, was a performance, a fragile illusion balanced on silence and fear. Weeks turned to months after Elias Worth's disappearance. The local whispers began, quiet at first. The master gone this long. Perhaps business kept him. Perhaps not. Caroline had prepared for every question, every curious glance. In the grand parlor, she received neighbors with the grace of a mourning queen. Her eyes were tired but resolute, her words measured. Elias is abroad handling debts, she would say, smiling faintly. He sends his regards. Her tone, her composure, all perfect. No one dared press further. The name Worth still carried weight, and Caroline wielded it like a weapon. But the real strength behind that mask of calm stood in the background. Josiah. He was no longer a servant in spirit, even if he still wore the title before others. His quiet authority guided every corner of the plantation. The workers obeyed him instinctively, the overseer's replacement deferred to his judgment. And every decision, every sack of cotton weighed, every coin collected, passed through his hands before reaching Caroline's desk. Together they rebuilt an empire upon ashes. At first, Caroline told herself it was necessity that bound her to him. She could not manage the estate alone. A woman, widowed and watched, was prey to lawyers and opportunists. But necessity gave way to trust, and trust soon deepened into something forbidden, something that felt as inevitable as sin. It began one humid evening in June. The air hung thick, perfumed by magnolia and decay. Caroline sat by the open window, the light of a single candle illuminating her journal. Josiah entered quietly, carrying the day's ledgers. His shirt clung to his chest, the sweat from the fields catching the glow of firelight. He placed the book before her without a word, and she looked up, too long, too softly. "You've done more for this land than any man before you," she said finally. "I did what had to be done," Josiah replied. Their eyes met. For a moment, the house itself seemed to hold its breath. "I cannot sleep," she admitted, closing her journal. "I see him sometimes, in the mirror. At the edge of my dreams." Josiah looked toward the dark window. "He can't hurt you now. You sound so certain," she whispered. "I made certain," he said. It was not comfort he offered, but a promise, and it broke something inside her. That night, for the first time, she allowed herself to weep in front of him. And when he reached for her, the space between guilt and desire vanished. It was not tenderness that drew them together, but the strange mercy of shared damnation. Their union was a quiet storm, dangerous and necessary, like fire in winter. From that night forward, the roles on Worth Plantation changed. Caroline no longer signed letters as Mrs. Worth. She began signing them as C. Josiah Worth. The merging of names was deliberate, if the world questioned it. They would find only power where scandal was expected. But guilt is a parasite. It feeds even in silence. One morning, a visitor arrived from New Orleans, a solicitor named Mr. Harding. He had been a business associate of Elias, come to inquire about old debts. Caroline met him on the veranda, her composure flawless. "My husband travels still," she said with her usual grace, "but I oversee the estate in his stead." Harding's eyes narrowed slightly. Strange, he said, for a man in business to travel without word for so long. She smiled faintly. Men often go silent when their fortunes change. Josiah appeared then, carrying a tray of tea, an act meant to appear servile, though his presence filled the air like quiet thunder. Harding studied him, something calculating behind his gaze. New help? He asked. Old help, Caroline replied smoothly. Trusted help. Harding nodded but lingered too long. His curiosity unsettled her. That night, she found Josiah standing at the edge of the magnolia grove, staring at the earth that hid their secret. He's asking questions, Josiah said without turning. I'll handle him, she replied. But Harding was not easily dismissed. He returned the next day, pressing for proof of correspondence, pressing for signatures. Caroline's patience cracked. Mr. Harding, she said coldly, you may tell your clients that the Worth accounts are closed. Should they wish to press the matter further, they will do so through the courts. And your husband? He asked quietly. Shall the courts summon him too? For a heartbeat, she froze. Then her expression softened into something chillingly calm. Mr. Harding, she said, her tone honeyed but venomous, my husband is wherever you wish him to be, provided you keep that wish silent. The man left that afternoon. Josiah watched his carriage disappear down the dirt road. He'll talk, he warned. Caroline turned to him. Then we will talk louder. Over the months that followed, the plantation's reputation changed. Rumors shifted from curiosity to reverence. The widow and her overseer were said to run the most prosperous estate in the region. Some whispered they had discovered gold, others swore it was witchcraft. But no one came too close. Prosperity silenced suspicion. Still, Caroline carried her secret like a fever. Every knock on the door made her heart race. Every letter delivered felt like a summons. She began locking the study each night and sleeping with a pistol beside her bed. The same weapon that had freed and damned them both. One night, she found Josiah awake by the fire, staring into the flames. You think too much, she said gently. And you dream too much, he replied. What do you dream of, Josiah? He hesitated. A world where no one owns another. She smiled sadly. And what would you do there? He turned to her then. Live, he said. Not hide. Not lie, just live. For the first time, she saw in him not just strength, but longing. A man caught between the chains of his past and the illusion of his present. She reached for his hand. Then we make that world, she whispered. He looked at her, wary and uncertain. Even if it costs more blood. Even if it costs heaven itself, she said. And thus, beneath the magnolia moonlight, Caroline Worth made her secret vow. To protect their empire, their sin, and their love, no matter the price. The South would remember her as a woman of poise, grace, and fortune. Only the earth beneath her house would remember the truth. By the summer of 1838, the Worth plantation had become an empire once again, not under the iron hand of Elias Worth, but under the quiet, calculating power of Josiah. What began as survival had turned into dominion. He had learned the language of ledgers and contracts, of commerce and deceit, mastering it faster than any white man had expected of him. Within a year, his name, or rather, the name Mr. J. Worth, which Caroline used on every document, became known in markets from Savannah to Charleston. Josiah had done what no enslaved man before him dared to dream. He owned, in secret, the very land that had owned him. It began with cotton, acres of it stretching beyond sight, tended by hands that now worked under fairer conditions. Josiah abolished the whip. He ended forced labor after dark. The fields ran smoother under his command, the workers more loyal. A man who eats well works well, he used to say, and they did. For the first time, laughter was heard on Worth soil. The overseers resented it, but Caroline silenced them with one sharp look. The results speak, she would say. You will not question how. Josiah's reforms made the plantation flourish. Buyers paid premiums for Worth cotton. The debts Elias left behind were paid in full within 2 seasons, and by the third, profit flowed in rivers. Gold and silver filled the ledgers that once dripped red with blood. Caroline handled correspondence by day. Josiah handled the work by night. Their partnership became legend. The mysterious widow and her shadow, whose fortune grew as others fell. But power does not rise quietly. It demands witnesses and envy. In nearby Charleston, whispers began to spread among the merchants. The Worth widow deals with someone, they said, a man unseen. Some say he's a freedman, Some say he's more than that. The rumors reached Caroline's ears, but she did not flinch. She hosted grand dinners again, wearing mourning black that had turned from sorrow to authority. At her side, she kept Josiah, not as servant, but as advisor. She defied custom by giving him voice in business meetings, and though some men scoffed, others listened. His intelligence was undeniable. His words carried weight. The very prejudice meant to keep him low only made his accent more terrifying. One evening, a wealthy cotton broker from Georgia, Mr. Dillard, visited the estate. After supper, he took Josiah aside on the veranda, glass of whiskey in hand. "You've done fine work here," Dillard said, his tone both impressed and cautious. "But men talk. They say you have too much influence. They say the lady's bewitched." Josiah's face remained still. Men talk when they fear what they don't understand. Dillard chuckled, swirling his drink. "And what should they understand? That land grows best under a steady hand," Josiah replied. "And mine is steady." The broker studied him for a long moment, then smiled thinly. "You sound like a man who's forgotten his place." Josiah leaned in slightly, his voice low and deliberate. "I remember every place I've ever been, sir. Especially the one where I was owned." Dillard's smile faltered. He finished his drink and left the plantation at dawn. Within weeks, the whispers grew darker. The notion of a black man ruling in secret over a southern estate was intolerable to the old order. Caroline sensed the shift. The visits from neighboring landowners became less frequent, the letters more formal. But the business, the money, only grew. Still, Josiah knew danger was coming. "We can't hide forever," he told Caroline one night as the candles burned low. "They'll come to test us." Caroline looked at him across the desk, her expression cool but not dismissive. "Let them," she said. "You've given them no reason to touch us, Di." "They don't need reason," Josiah said. "Only rumor." That winter his fear proved right. A local preacher, Reverend Abbott, began preaching sermons about the fall of moral order, warning that unnatural unions and unholy ambition were infecting the land. Everyone knew who he meant. Caroline heard the gossip in town. "The widow has taken her servant to her bed. He runs the plantation now. Her husband never left. He was replaced." Each whisper carried a piece of the truth. Caroline responded the only way she knew, with power. She donated heavily to the church, invited the reverend to supper, and charmed him into silence. Her wit disarmed him, but her presence unsettled him. "Mrs. Worth," he stammered during dinner, "the Lord blesses charity, but he punishes sin." She smiled sweetly. "Then perhaps, Reverend, he should have punished my husband long ago. But he sent Josiah instead." Abbott never returned. That same winter, Josiah made his boldest move. He began purchasing neighboring lands, quietly, through intermediaries. By spring, the Worth plantation had doubled in size. And when Caroline signed the deeds, she used the name Josiah C. Worth. The initials stood for Caroline, but the town believed otherwise. It was the first public acknowledgement of him as a man of property, even if the law would not permit it. The news spread like wildfire. A black man, once a slave, now owned half the county. The newspapers would not print it, but the streets whispered his legend. Some admired him, others plotted his ruin. In Charleston, a rival landowner, Mr. Harwood, summoned Caroline for a business dinner. She went with Josiah. The invitation was a test, and both knew it. As they entered the candlelit hall, the other guests fell silent. Josiah, dressed in a dark tailored suit, stood tall beside her. He met their stares without flinching. The room bristled with disbelief. Harwood greeted Caroline with a smile too sharp to be kind. "My dear lady," he said, "I hear your overseer has quite the head for numbers." "He does," she replied. "Better than most men I've met." A murmur rippled through the table. Harwood leaned forward. "And what, may I ask, is your arrangement?" Caroline smiled faintly, her eyes glinting. "Partnership," she said, "the kind that builds empires while others gossip." Laughter filled the table, forced, uneasy. But beneath the mockery, fear had taken root. They knew what they saw: a woman who defied the law and a man who defied his past. Together, they were unstoppable. When they returned home that night, Josiah stood beneath the magnolia trees and looked up at the house. "You've given me everything," he said quietly. "Freedom, land, name. But one day, they'll come for it." Caroline stepped beside him, her hand slipping into his. "Then they'll find we've already buried one man here," she said. We can bury more. The moonlight fell across their faces. Her pale and haunted, his strong and determined. Two sinners bound by fate and fortune. The magnolias swayed softly, petals falling like ghosts. By the next harvest, Josiah's wealth surpassed that of most white men in the county. To the world, he was still a shadow behind the Worth name. But to those who worked the fields, he was Master Worth. And they spoke his name with both fear and reverence. Yet under all his triumph, the earth still whispered the name of the man he had killed, and Josiah knew every coin he touched was minted from sin. By 1839, the Worth plantation had become the crown jewel of the county, vast, efficient, and terrifyingly quiet. The cotton fields rolled like waves of white silk, and the manor house stood tall again, its windows glowing with oil lamps each night. Outsiders saw prosperity, insiders felt tension. Beneath the perfection lay something darker, the weight of a secret that had not rotted, only deepened. Josiah walked those fields every morning before dawn. The mist clung low to the soil, curling around his boots, whispering like breath from the dead. He paused often near the magnolia grove, that sacred, cursed place where Elias Worth slept beneath the roots. The earth there had settled unevenly, and no grass grew. Each time it rained, the soil bled red mud, like the ground itself remembered. Caroline forbade the workers from going near it. The earth's unkind there, she would say, her voice calm but cold. Leave it be. None questioned her, none dared. They whispered instead that ghosts walked that grove. The old masters, the ones he'd whipped, maybe even worse, at night. Some swore they saw light flickering among the magnolias, like candles carried by unseen hands. But Josiah knew the truth. It was not haunting, it was warning. He felt it each time he closed his eyes. In dreams, Elias rose from the ground, wet, broken, furious. The voice came in whispers, you took my land. You took my wife. You think you'll keep them? Josiah would wake drenched in sweat, the phantom scent of gunpowder still hanging in the room. The guilt that once belonged to Caroline now lived in him too. One night, long past midnight, he found her in the study, seated by the fire, her hands shaking as she wrote. He approached quietly. You're awake again. She didn't look up. So are you. Dreams. No, she said. Memories. He sat beside her, watching the firelight catch the edge of her cheekbone. You've been writing that same letter for weeks, he said softly. Who's it for? She closed the book sharply. No one living. Their eyes met. They both knew what she meant. For all their success, the house had grown colder. The servants obeyed, but with a fearful kind of reverence. The old families no longer visited, and the town gossiped in tones of envy mixed with suspicion. The couple who had risen too high, too fast. The widow who broke laws of God and man alike. The former slave who now gave orders to white traders. To the world they were a scandal wrapped in silk. To each other, they were a secret wrapped in blood. Then came the first sign that their peace was cracking. One afternoon, a laborer came running from the grove, pale as ash. Mistress, he stammered, the ground's come open. Caroline and Josiah rushed to the site. Rain had loosened the soil, and part of the earth had collapsed, exposing the corner of a wooden plank. Josiah's stomach twisted. The grave had risen. He turned to the men. No one touches this, he said sharply. Fill it back, now. But Caroline froze. Her eyes locked on the exposed board, and something beneath it, a glint of metal. The gold signet ring that Elias always wore. The past had surfaced. That night, as thunder rolled in again, she and Josiah returned to the grove with lanterns. We should move him, Josiah said. Somewhere far. Caroline shook her head. No, that's exactly how men like him haunt forever. Disturb them, they never rest. I already doesn't. She turned, voice sharp. Then let him stay where his pride buried him. Their argument echoed through the dark until the rain began again, heavy and relentless. They worked in silence to cover the grave, each shovelful of dirt falling like a curse. When they finished, Caroline stood motionless, her gown soaked, hair plastered to her face. You hear it too, don't you? She whispered. Josiah stared at her. Hear what? The whisper. She said, eyes wide. When the wind moves through the trees, it says my name. He wanted to dismiss it, to tell her it was only grief, but the truth was heavier. Sometimes, he heard it too. The next morning, the air in the house changed. Mirrors cracked without reason, doors opened themselves, candles guttered and flared. The servants whispered that the master's spirit had returned for vengeance. Caroline ignored them, but her hands trembled when she poured her tea. Then, a letter arrived, sealed in black wax. It bore the mark of Mr. Harding, the solicitor who had once questioned Elias's disappearance. Caroline opened it with careful fingers. Inside the message was brief: "To the widow Worth, rumors of your husband's fate reach every corner. There are those who would pay dearly for the truth. Consider this your only warning. H." Caroline crushed the letter into the fire. "He knows," she whispered. Josiah's jaw tightened. "Then he dies knowing nothing." But she grabbed his arm, her nails digging in. "No more graves," she hissed. "We're already living on one." Her words silenced him. He understood the cost. Yet the fire inside him, the same one that had pulled the trigger years ago, would not go out. Weeks later, Harding's carriage was found overturned near the bayou. The sheriff called it an accident. The town called it divine justice. But Caroline never asked Josiah where he had been that night. From then on, the whispers in the grove stopped. The earth grew still again. The magnolia trees bloomed brighter than ever, unnaturally so. White petals fell each morning like fresh snow, covering the ground where blood once soaked. Josiah and Caroline continued to rise. He expanded the business into shipping. She invested in mills. Together, they built a fortune worth more than any Southern family could boast. But the more they gained, the less they slept. The house felt alive and hungry. One night, Josiah stood on the veranda watching the grove sway in the wind. Caroline came to his side, her face pale under moonlight. "You ever think about what we've done?" she asked. He didn't answer at first. "Every day. And you do it again." He looked at her. The woman who had turned his chains into gold, his sin into empire. "Yes," he said finally. "But I'd dig deeper." For a moment she laughed, hollow and beautiful. Then her eyes softened. "Then perhaps we deserve each other." The wind shifted, carrying with it the faintest scent of earth and decay. The magnolias rustled like applause from the dead. And somewhere beneath their roots, just once, as if something buried long ago had smiled. By 1840, the world had learned the name Josiah Worth, though not its truth. Newspapers in Savannah wrote of the mysterious black financier who commands Southern markets through the widow's estate. The whispers no longer stayed confined to parlors. They traveled across the South, bending ears, stirring envy. What began as rumor had grown into legend, and legends have a way of demanding blood. The Worth fortune had multiplied. Josiah now controlled 3 plantations, 2 textile mills, and a shipping company that sent cotton as far as Liverpool. He had everything a man could dream of: land, wealth, respect, and the heart of the woman once above him in station. Yet when he walked the halls of his mansion at night, the shadows still spoke his name. He had begun to hear things. The creak of the old study door at the hour Elias Worth died, the faint rattle of glasses in the cellar when no wind blew. Servants muttered that the house was cursed, that its riches were bought with a murdered man's soul. Josiah silenced them with coin. But fear lingers even when mouths are paid to close. Caroline, meanwhile, was not well. Her beauty remained, but her spirit had frayed like old lace. She no longer attended social functions or hosted the elegant suppers that once disarmed suspicion. Instead, she wandered the house at night, candle in hand, whispering to no one. Josiah found her one evening standing before the grand mirror in the parlor, tracing the edge of her reflection. She murmured, "He watches when the lights go out." Josiah took the candle from her trembling hand. "You need rest." "I need forgiveness," she said softly. "From whom?" "God, perhaps." Her eyes met his, hollow yet fierce. "But I don't think he listens to people like us anymore." He said nothing. What could God say to a man who had bought salvation with murder? Days turned into months, and prosperity became their prison. Every coin that clinked on the Worth table sounded like the toll of a funeral bell. Josiah threw himself into work, overseeing shipments, negotiating with brokers, building alliances with freedmen across the coast. His vision was clear: to create an empire owned by black hands in a world that still called him property. But with power came danger. One afternoon, a preacher named Reverend Abbott returned to town, the same man Caroline had once silenced with charm. He now led fiery sermons about the sins of pride and blasphemy upon cursed ground. He spoke of a plantation built on murder, of unnatural masters, of the devil's marriage hidden under magnolia bloom. His words caught fire the hearts of white men eager to hate. Josiah heard of it from a trader who visited the estate. Abbott stirring talk in town. The man warned. He says your fortune came from witchcraft, from blood. Josiah's jaw tightened. Maybe he's half right. That night, Caroline begged him not to confront the Reverend. You'll only feed his flames, she pleaded. But Josiah was already dressed to leave. There are men who need fear more than faith, he said coldly. And I've been both. He found Abbott preaching to a crowd outside the courthouse. Lanterns glowed like watchful eyes as the preacher shouted, "There are sins that rot the earth itself. A house that grows rich on the bones of the damned cannot stand." Josiah waited until the sermon ended. As the crowd dispersed, he stepped forward, his boots echoing on the cobblestone. "You speak of rot," he said evenly, "but you preach from a pulpit built on it." Abbott flinched at the sight of him. "You've no right to speak, boy. You are the proof of what I preach, sin given flesh." Josiah stepped closer. "Say my name? I know your name." "Say it," Josiah demanded. Abbott's lips trembled. "Josiah Worth." The air between them seemed to freeze. Josiah's voice lowered to a whisper. "Then remember it when you pray." He left without another word, but that night the church burned to its foundation. No one saw who set the fire, but every man in town knew whose shadow had been there. Caroline never asked questions again. She didn't need to. The months that followed brought more riches and more ruin. The Worth name now commanded fear across 3 states. Merchants bowed, politicians visited, and even former slave traders sought his advice. Josiah had built his empire from the ashes of his master, but each triumph carried a haunting echo. Caroline, frail and fevered, began to speak in riddles. "We built heaven," she'd whisper, "but it sounds like hell." At times, she refused to enter the study, claiming she heard Elias's voice there. "He laughs when you count your gold," she told Josiah once. "He says you've become him." Those words struck deeper than she knew. One evening, Josiah found himself staring at the mirror where Caroline once saw ghosts. His reflection stared back, proud, dressed in silk, dripping with wealth. And yet his eyes were Elias's eyes, the same cold certainty, the same hunger. He realized then that he had not freed himself from his master's shadow. He had inherited it. The next day, he ordered all mirrors in the house covered. "There are things best unseen," he told the servants. But the curse did not end with glass. The magnolia grove, long silent, began to stir again. Servants found the soil cracked open in places, as though something pushed from beneath. One morning, a worker came to Josiah with trembling hands. "Sir," he said, "the earth, it moves." Josiah went himself. Beneath the oldest tree where he and Caroline had buried Elias years ago, the ground had split. Inside, faint glints of bone shone through. The storm the night before had done what guilt could not, unearthed their sin. Caroline collapsed when she saw it. "It's a sign," she cried. "God's done with us." But Josiah stared at the bones and felt something different. Not fear, but defiance. "Then let him look," he said. "Let him see what man can become without his mercy." That night, he ordered the grave filled again, deeper, heavier. He worked until dawn, his hands blistered, his breath ragged. When he finished, he whispered into the ground, "You stay buried. I'll finish what you couldn't." The next morning, the magnolia trees bloomed early, white, pure, almost heavenly. Caroline saw them from the window and wept. "Even the trees pretend," she said. But Josiah didn't hear. He was already planning new ventures. A railroad investment, a warehouse expansion. His hunger had no end. He no longer dreamed of freedom. He dreamed of legacy. And as the South whispered his name, the land itself whispered back. Not in praise, but in warning. For every seed of wealth he planted, blood waited beneath to feed it. And beneath the magnolia roots, the bones of Elias Worth grinned, for he knew that Josiah in the end had become just like him. By the spring of 1865, the world Josiah had built stood at the edge of collapse. The Civil War had turned the South into a graveyard, and the old order was dying with it. Plantations burned, masters fled, and fortunes that once ruled the world turned to ash. Yet amid the ruin, one man's wealth only seemed to grow. Josiah Worth, once a slave, now rode through Louisiana's broken fields like a monarch surveying his wounded kingdom. His carriages bore the Worth crest. His men, freed slaves all, guarded his estate as soldiers might guard a throne. The war had made other men poor, but Josiah had played the chaos like a symphony. He sold cotton to the Union and fed the Confederates, trading morality for profit until gold flowed through his hands like holy water. But gold, like sin, leaves a stain. Caroline lay dying in the same house where she had once ruled in silks and pearls. Disease had hollowed her frame, her once vibrant voice now rasped like dry leaves. The doctors called it consumption, but Josiah knew better. She was dying of guilt. Every night she called for her husband, not him, but the one beneath the magnolia trees. "Elias," she whispered in her fever, "I see you by the fire." Josiah sat beside her silent. He no longer corrected her. He knew some ghosts preferred to be fed with silence. One night, as rain whispered against the window panes, Caroline reached for his hand. "Josiah," she said weakly, "promise me you'll stop counting." He frowned. "Counting what?" "The coins," she said. "The deeds, the acres. You count them every day. They weigh more than your soul." Josiah stared at her, the candlelight dancing across his face. "I count to remember," he said. "To remember what?" "What I paid." Her eyes softened. "And was it worth it?" He said nothing. He didn't know any more. She died that night, her final breath lost in the sound of thunder. Josiah sat beside her body until dawn, staring at the pale stillness that had once been warmth. When the servants came to take her away, he raised a hand. "Leave her," he said quietly. "She will not be buried here." He ordered her interred in the churchyard of St. Augustine's, the same church whose preacher he had once burned to the ground. He rebuilt the chapel, funded a new bell tower, and paid every debt the church ever owed. When they asked why, he said only, because she believed. The funeral drew hundreds, freedmen, planters, soldiers, widows, all whispering of the spectacle. A black man burying a white mistress with such pomp was unheard of. But Josiah no longer bowed to whispers. He walked behind her coffin, his head held high, his cane striking the cobblestones like the beat of a drum. When the priest spoke of forgiveness, Josiah almost laughed. Forgiveness was a luxury for those who had sinned politely. His were carved in bone and blood. After the burial, he returned to the estate that now belonged wholly to him. The law tried to challenge it. Neighbors petitioned, lawyers threatened. Even distant kin of Elias Worth claimed inheritance. But Josiah had prepared too well. Every deed, every signature bore Caroline's name in ink that was legal, binding, unassailable. Her fortune, her land, her empire, all of it passed to him. The newspapers called it a scandal, a disgrace, the downfall of Southern purity. But none could deny the numbers. Josiah Worth was now one of the wealthiest men in Louisiana, perhaps in all the South. He expanded further, opening schools for freedmen, building houses for war widows, buying land that white men abandoned. For every insult thrown his way, he bought another acre of their pride. And slowly, the jeers turned to fear, then to respect. Children pointed at him on the streets of New Orleans, whispering, "That's him, the Black King." Yet inside, the crown burned. He wandered the halls of his empty house, every door echoing like a memory. He had wealth beyond imagination, but the laughter, the warmth, the whispers of love were gone. The mansion, once alive with Caroline's music, now breathed only the soft hum of loneliness. Sometimes he caught his reflection in the window glass and thought he saw Elias Worth staring back. The same tilt of the chin, the same prideful sneer. It frightened him how much he had come to resemble the man he killed. Late one night, he took his old pistol, the one that had ended Elias's life, and set it on the desk beside a pile of gold coins. He poured himself a drink and spoke into the dark. "You see it now, don't you?" he murmured. "You see what you made." The room stayed silent, but in his heart he heard the ghost answer, "I didn't make you. You made me again." He laughed bitterly. "Maybe I did." The next morning, Josiah announced the founding of the Worth Institute, a school for freedmen's children, to teach them reading, trade, and the language of power. Education, he declared, is the new gold. The newspapers hailed it as a miracle, but those who looked closer saw something else. A man trying to cleanse his sins with charity. But sin, once buried, never dies. As he aged, Josiah began to feel the weight of all he had taken. His hands, once strong, trembled when he signed documents. He sometimes wandered to the Magnolia Grove, standing above the grave that had started it all. The ground was calm now, the blooms full and white. But beneath them lay the truth, one that even time refused to forgive. He would stand there for hours, cane in hand, whispering to the soil, "You still down there, old man?" And though no answer came, He often thought he heard the faint echo of laughter carried by the wind. By the end of that year, the South had changed forever. The old masters were gone, the fields empty, and Josiah Worth, a man born a slave, stood as one of its richest survivors. Yet as his wealth grew, so did the hollowness inside him. He had everything Elias Worth once possessed: land, name, power, and ghosts. But what he lacked was peace, and peace, he knew now, was the one thing no fortune could buy. He returned home that night and wrote a single line in his ledger. Beneath every number, every sum, every transaction, all debts paid. Then he closed the book, blew out the candle, and walked into the silence of his empty empire. For the queen was gone, the gold cursed, and the king, though he stood tall, was already dying inside. When the year 1872 came, Louisiana had changed beyond recognition. The war was long over, the Confederacy nothing but a ghost that refused to rest. The fields once soaked with sweat and blood now grew wild with untended grass, and the white masters who had ruled like gods were either dead, exiled, or ruined. Yet one name still carried power in the whispers of planters and preachers alike: Josiah Worth, the man they could neither forgive nor forget. He was no longer young. The sharp strength that once defined his frame had softened with age, and streaks of gray threaded through his black hair like threads of ash. But his eyes, calm, cold, and calculating, had not dimmed. They carried the same fire that had burned on the night he killed his master, the same relentless hunger that had lifted him from chains to throne. Josiah lived alone now. The grand Worth plantation, rebuilt 3 times after fire, flood, and time, stood silent, a mausoleum of his own making. Servants came and went, their footsteps echoing through marble halls, but he spoke to few. His study remained untouched, its shelves lined with ledgers, deeds, and papers that told the story of a man who had bent history to his will. They said he was worth over $300,000, a staggering sum in those years. His lands stretched from Baton Rouge to the Mississippi Delta. His ships moved cotton, lumber, and sugar across oceans. Northern investors sought his partnership, Southern men cursed his name, and freedmen spoke of him with reverence. Some called him a savior, others called him a devil. Josiah called himself neither. He spent his days walking the grounds alone, cane tapping softly against the stones, passing the magnolia grove where the secret of his fortune lay buried. The trees had grown enormous now, their roots knotted deep into the soil like veins clutching old bones. He often stopped there, staring into the shade, as though the ghosts that lingered beneath demanded acknowledgement. It was said that Josiah never attended church, yet the church bells he paid to rebuild still rang every Sunday morning. He never knelt in prayer, yet he donated to every orphanage and freedmen's school within 100 miles. He never married again, but every year, on the anniversary of Caroline's death, he placed a single white magnolia on her grave and stood there for hours in silence. The townsfolk saw his charity and called it redemption. They didn't know it was penance. By now, the stories of his rise had become folklore. Some said he had poisoned his master. Others claimed he struck a deal with the devil beneath a magnolia tree, trading his soul for gold. Children dared each other to sneak near his house at night, to glimpse the shadow of the Black King of Louisiana. Josiah paid them no mind. He knew how people built myths, and how easily they broke men. One evening, he summoned his old accountant, a man named Givens who had served him since the early days. "How much is left?" Josiah asked, his voice quieter now. Givens opened the ledger, adjusting his spectacles. "Your estate's value stands at $312,000, sir." "More, if we count the new warehouse expansion." Josiah stared at the numbers for a long while, and yet, he murmured, "I've never felt poorer." "Sir, tell me," Josiah asked, looking up, "when a man buys his freedom with blood, does the debt ever end?" The accountant hesitated. "Freedom has no price, Mr. Worth." Josiah smiled faintly. "Then perhaps I paid too much." That night, as rain began to fall, Josiah sat by the fire and read through Caroline's old letters. Soft paper yellowed with time. In them, she spoke of dreams, redemption, and faith. Her final letter, written weeks before her death, ended with a line that pierced him even now. "You became everything they said you could never be. Just don't become everything they were." He folded the letter, his eyes distant. "Too late for that," he whispered. His health began to falter soon after. The doctors came and went, prescribing rest, tonics, and peace of mind, luxuries he could not afford. At night, fever dreams haunted him. He saw Elias Worth at the foot of his bed, smiling that same cruel smile, whispering, "You took my place, well, boy." Josiah would wake in a cold sweat, gripping the sheets, heart pounding like the echo of that single gunshot years ago. As the fever deepened, his servants found him wandering the halls, murmuring numbers, not of wealth but of names. Elias, Caroline, all of them. He whispered, as though accounting for every soul his choices had touched. In his final days, he ordered one last will written. "My fortune," he said, "is to be divided into 3 parts, one for the freedmen's schools, one for the church, and one for the poor of this county, black and white alike." The lawyer hesitated. "And the rest, Mr. Worth? Your home?" "Yeah," Josiah smiled faintly. "Let the earth keep them. It's taken enough from me." On the night of August 3rd, 1872, a storm rolled across Louisiana, thunder shaking the fields, wind tearing through magnolia branches. Inside the Worth estate, Josiah lay still in his bed, breathing shallowly as lightning flashed across the walls. He whispered something then, soft but clear enough for the servant beside him to hear. "All debts paid." Then he exhaled once and did not breathe again. The news spread fast. Josiah Worth, the richest black man in the South, was dead. Thousands attended his funeral. Freedmen who owed him wages, merchants who owed him debts, and white men who owed him envy. The preacher called him a man who rose higher than the world allowed, but others whispered he rose on a grave. His tombstone was simple, unmarked except for one line carved deep into the stone. He paid his own price. Years later, the magnolia grove behind the Worth mansion was struck by lightning. The oldest tree split open, its roots revealing fragments of old bone. A jaw, a ring, a rusted pistol. The townspeople gasped, and rumors spread again. But no one dared disturb the grave. Some said it was the master still guarding his gold. Others said it was the servant guarding his sin. And when the wind blew through the trees, it carried a whisper that no one could explain. Part laughter, part prayer, part curse, said softly, "Freedom was never free,